Hello, good afternoon. My name is Kirill Gerstein, and you've tuned into Kirill Gerstein Invites, an online forum hosted by Kronberg Academy. And today we have the double pleasure of being physically hosted by the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra. We're in their container. It's actually a lovely place, but it is indeed a converted shipping container, and it's in Werksviertel, which is the site of the future Konzerthaus in Munich, the future home of the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra. And I'm here with a dear friend and a great musician, great conductor, Alan Gilbert. This week we are playing together with the musicians of the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra in Herkulessaal. And it gave us a chance to sit down here together and with all of you joining us live. And the starting point to our discussion, as you saw in the announcement, is can conducting be taught? Alan is, of course, a great practitioner of the art of conducting, as well as a teacher, and he, I think, revamped and re-energized the conducting program at Juilliard while he was the music director of New York Philharmonic. All of these things you know, and so we'll just launch straight into it. Thank you, Alan. Thank you for finding the time, sitting down, and let's talk about conducting. And one final reminder, this is a live session and I can see your questions on my little screen here. And so please contribute them in the Q&A box or in chat, and I'll pass them on to Alan. And so your participation is very vital to this event. So Alan, hi.
Thank you so much for asking me to do this. It's amazing. You have this great thing going and all these people joining. It's wonderful that you do this. I think it's important to talk about what we do.
Well, it's been a thrill. It really feels like a real community, and with a lot of interaction. And it does give a chance to discuss things that my guests are passionate about, and some things that we wouldn't necessarily usually read in a magazine or hear on a standard radio program. And so today, as a departure point, and I'm sure we'll cover many various areas and subjects, but you suggested, half jokingly, titling this session, Can Conducting
Completely
Be...
jokingly.
Yes, well, and then it all takes a serious turn of events. So... starting with a silly question. So do you think it can be taught?
It is hopefully a good launching point, because there's a short answer, which is yes, and then we could say goodnight and go have our dinner. But obviously the implication by even asking the question, it kind of answers itself by just being stated in the first place as a kind of a provocative question, is I think it's very hard to teach conducting. It's one of the things that I have loved to attempt, and I've really put a lot of time and thought into it. And I would say that I've had, varying degrees of success over the years, but it's a very elusive subject, because I think conducting itself is hard to pin down.
This was going to be my next question, or a step back. If we're discussing teaching conducting, can we first try to define, and this interests me very much, how you see as a conductor, what is conducting?
Well, that's really what the question is. I mean, it's a question about a much bigger subject than the teaching of conducting. It obviously really what we're talking about is the field, or art, if I may say, of conducting, and it's a, for me, endlessly fascinating subject. But to sort of frame the discussion, we've all seen conductors who look as if everything should be just sounding brilliant and perfect and together, because somehow the gesture looks very organized and coordinated and poised and thought out, and somehow the music doesn't necessarily come alive. That can happen. And then we've seen conductors who just if you turn off the sound and you look, you think, how is it possible that anyone could possibly follow that? And the results are glorious and inspiring and spiritual. So it's not as if there's a clear one-to-one connection between this gesture and that sound. There's obviously more to it. And I guess at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day, conducting is about helping the musicians you are working with to do their best, to sound the best, to be able to play their instruments in concert, in coordination, of course in concerts as well, effectively, in a coordinated way, with shared purpose, with the ability to interact with each other, as well as possible. That's what musicians want to do. That's what music is about. How to do that, there are certain things that are standard practices in terms of the shape of the gesture, beating a 4 pattern like this or a 3 pattern like this, showing a legato or staccato. I mean, there's things that you can break down, break conducting down into its elements, but then beyond that,
I mean, I think we have, and I know that some of our participants are very much embedded in the profession. Some are conductors, some are musicians that play with conductors, and at the same time, there are a lot of people that are interested in music, go to concerts, attend these seminars, and so also from that perspective, from the public's perspective, obviously it's easy to understand, okay, the conductor helps to coordinate, which is just one of the functions. On the other hand, we can say that many of the great orchestras in standard and well-known repertoire require not that much coordination to simply play together. So something else and different is happening that the conductor is contributing, and those things are.
Yeah, it's really one of the things that I talk about when people ask me, how do you teach conducting? And it is a subject that does seem to interest people, so I guess that's why we're talking about it here. One of the things I often say is that conducting is a fascinating life. It's a fascinating profession because it calls on so many faculties. There's the kind of, musical, spiritual, social, intellectual, dare I say political, practical. I mean, they're all the ulls. I call them the ulls. And in order to be a successful conductor, you have to, if not have mastered all of these, at least have a passing familiarity and a kind of ability to deal with the areas. And it requires quite a rich background, I would say. And when you stand in front of a marvelous orchestra like the BRSO that we're lucky to work with this week, they are used to a certain level of experience and background, and somebody who is able to sort of meet them on their terms and speak to them in their language. And obviously conduct in a way that they understand, but also stand in front of them and be able to point out what it is that they find is important about making music. And it's tricky for a young conductor to conduct a great orchestra. I mean, it's hard for anybody, but if you stand in front of an orchestra that has, say, played Beethoven Fifth Symphony literally hundreds of times, how can you possibly make it better than what they're used to? And that's already a challenge. And there's something about the kind of feeling that a conductor has when they stand in front of an orchestra that has to be based in self-confidence and has to be based in the ability to speak the language of orchestra. And that's a very kind of not well-defined term, but it's actually something that I think it's important to think about. And this is part of what at least I try to do when I take a stab at this teaching conducting.
And the language of the orchestra, I assume it varies very much. Sort of, there are very local dialects, or is it rather for you sort of your signature language of how you speak to the orchestra?
I would say rather the former example. There's orchestras have different expectations, of course. On a very basic level, they're different actual languages that they speak. They're different experiences that they've had studying, but it really is about being able to contend, and I use the word advisedly, to contend with the implicit challenge that orchestras present to any conductor, based on their musical experience and their expectations that orchestras have, and orchestras do, and reasonably, and should have high expectations, especially the ones at the highest level, and even if you have the ability to move your hands, there's something that comes from having dealt with a number of these areas. I say that you have to have dealt with a lot of areas, and that's how I created my curriculum. We're kind of talking all around the map, but maybe eventually we'll sort of start to focus.
But outlining the territory.
But the conducting is about dealing with many different areas. So when I designed my curriculum, it wasn't as if I sat down in one afternoon and wrote it down, but I kind of approached it circularly, or kind of in a kind of whirlwind of directions. I tried to introduce as many areas as possible, because if you can't master an area, at least you can be aware that it exists. Because I always say that you can't deal with an area until you realize that it is an area. And so we would have, our classes where I would talk a little bit about technique and analysis, but also there were always these seminars, and it could have been about movement, Tai Chi. It could be a meeting with a manager. It could be a meeting with the librarian of the New York Philharmonic, because when I was at Juilliard, it was wonderful to have the New York Philharmonic right there. Or it could have been someone who talked about dance or Baroque style or pronunciation of Russian, or there's no limit.
So we would bombard them from all sides.
Just from all sides, just to at least create a kind of memory bank of areas. And the thing that so many young conductors miss or lack when they finally stand in front of an orchestra is, I guess it amounts to what I call the culture of conducting. And this is connected, or maybe it's the same thing as the language of orchestras. The ability to actually be impressive enough, having dealt with enough areas, in order to, first of all, deserve to stand there, but also to be able to make something of it.
Well, if we go some step-by-step questions about studying it and teaching it before returning to the general metaphysical questions also of what is conducting, I guess, and I have heard, and it seems to be on the surface, one of the problems for conductors is, for conducting students, is this lack of an actual instrument. Whereas a pianist, I can book a room and practice to my heart's content. Same thing with any other instrumentalist. What are some of the solutions that are possible within the practicality of a study program for conductors to have an instrument?
Yeah, no, you put your finger on a very, very crucial area, and that's the actual experience that you need working with a real orchestra. And orchestras are a precious resource, and they're made up of many people, and if they're sitting there spending their time, it's only reasonable to use that time wisely. Excuse me. And you have, it's a catch-22. You have to have had experience very often in order to be asked. But at the point that you don't have experience, you understand the issue. Yeah. You somehow have to break that kind of cruel cycle that makes it difficult to break in and start getting that first experience. The idea is to, in the right way, start out and actually try it, because you do need to have that taste of what it feels like to make a gesture and have something come back. or not. And that the actual working with musicians when you conduct is essential. You can't practice it in your mind.
So what are some of the solutions? I mean, I know, for example, in the old days of conducting programs in Moscow and Leningrad conservatories, a lot was done. You see these muses masterclasses with two pianists playing. Do you find that's a useful thing, or because it's two pianists that this doesn't give that taste?
I mean, it's you can't pretend that it's the same, and as wonderful as the piano is as an instrument, and it's certainly the pinnacle of instruments in my mind, it's different from an orchestra, and the response of sound and the by definition decay of every single note that happens is you don't get the same feeling of dealing with the sound from moment to moment when you conduct a piano. A great pianist obviously can give the impression of a line that is endless.
All we give is impressions at best.
Well,
I mean,
but that's what it is.
It's an instrument of illusion.
No, but it is indeed, and unfortunately, I apologize that my cough it's a post-COVID. The problem is when I talk
commiserate.
a lot, yes. When I talk a lot, it comes. Thank you for saving me. No, but I think it's better than not having two pianos to conduct, for sure.
Or is the answer smaller chamber group constellations?
Absolutely worth doing. It's also not the same as a full orchestra, but you in a sense you have to take what you've got. You have to accept what is there. Sorry, no, it will subside. I apologize to all of you out there. It's I don't have COVID. I did have COVID, but this is basically the only vestige of it right now, and unfortunately, it's the last thing you want to have when you're doing a live webinar.
Well, at least a friend once told me that he spoke to Glenn Gould on the phone and he coughed, and Glenn Gould, being famously a hypochondriac, hung up the phone. Yeah. So,
you can't be too careful.
This is not contagious.
It's you have to get the sense of making a gesture and having a response. So sometimes what we would do in class, if we didn't have an orchestra, is we would actually sing to each other. We would have one person conduct and the rest would
sing, not play,
or sing and play. Whatever. And because any kind of interaction between two musicians, or by extension,
a gesture and a sounding response,
is already, that is conducting. That's what it is. It's a little bit different when it's just pianos, but even that is also conducting. But you have to realize that there's a different feeling when you can actually do something, not just give the impression of doing something with the sound between the beats. And that's another area which we can talk about. It's all about what's in between the beats. It's not about beats. Conducting, people say, oh, it's beating time. It's about much more than that.
Yeah. I mean, yes, we think about this constantly. And just last week I was with your colleague Hannu Lintu, who was also saying, this is sound. What's in between is sound. And then he threw a menu in the air. So that's not sound. There's no connection to anything. Right. So that I really want to talk about, and this I'm fascinated with every day that I try to play myself, and whenever I play with somebody like yourself. So what is happening? This expression of gesture in the sound, or the gesture that is then expressed in the sound. I mean, that truly seems sort of magical from where I'm sitting. And I'm sure you've made many thoughts about.
It's basically what I think about. You want, my father is a very good conductor, and he was my first conducting teacher. And he always said, and I think he's right, that the main job of a conductor is to determine the tempo. Because the tempo is what makes the music happen, come alive. And the idea of what a right tempo is, a correct tempo, is nuanced and complicated, because it can be slightly different from moment to moment, or even
It's
night to night. I mean, is there a right tempo? I mean, this is a whole, talk about metaphysical, but it's a philosophical discussion. I happen to think there is such a thing as a right tempo. The right tempo can change. Like, for example, one of the things that you're very kind. You're trying everything you can to save me from myself, which, it's ultimately not going to happen. But say you're working in opera. One singer, people talk about voices that move easily and voices that don't move quite as easily. So you can have two perhaps equally great artists singing the same role on different nights, and the actual tempo that comes out will be different because the way the voice moves is different. And so with one voice, a tempo might feel too fast, and that same tempo might feel perfect for another voice. So, I mean, that's just a kind of an example of how tempo is a fluid concept at the very least. But to get back to conducting, the idea is to try to get the right tempo. And there is a sense of a right tempo. You can feel when it's right, or at least close to right. And it has to do with much more than just the metronome marking, but how the spirit of the music is, or whether it's feathery texture or heavy.
Would you say it's kind of a physical sensation?
I think when it's right, you can feel that it's right, but it's connected to, many, many different things. So anyway, the function of a conductor anyway is, in any case, to determine the tempo. Because if you have a group of 80 musicians, there will be slight disagreements, and you have to come to some sort of agreement. And the paradigm is set up so that the conductor is the one who chooses. But of course, even that is not as simple as it sounds, because there's a give and take that happens all along. But people, understandably, when they try to conduct, are very concerned with putting their beats at the right time. Or they should be, I would say. Some conductors, we wish they were more concerned with that, but that's another story. The idea of conducting is, very basically, you'll read this in any conducting book, that the upbeat is what shows the tempo. And if you have to conduct, say, a pizzicato where the whole string section plays just a bunk at the same time, you have to give a clear upbeat that somehow inevitably leads to a point that everybody understands we play now. And the interesting thing is that even when there's no sound between beats, I find that the most successful way to show where the next beat in time, the next point in time is happening, is actually to think as if there is a constant, well, it's often a curve, but something happening between the beats that actually follows a course and takes its trip until the next beat. So if there's a note happening, obviously that note has a life during something that you're thinking about all the time when you are in fact just listening to the note get softer, but musically it's the same idea. I'm actually finding more and more as I get older and have more experience that it's not so much about the beats, and that the clarity of time is actually better served by, in fact, only thinking about what's happening between the beats.
And that the sort of the points of the beats are just a consequence of
the journey between the beats. This is hard to teach. It's hard to learn, for sure.
I mean, it is very Tai Chi.
It's totally Tai Chi. It's also, there's a kind of trust also. And the idea is to, if you're teaching, you can't master that probably ever in your whole life. You can only get better and have a richer understanding of what you're trying to do. But to teach that idea is really, really tricky. To give a student the idea of what it feels like to live between the beats. And actually, one of the greatest conducting teachers, who's, he's not conducting now basically, but Seiji Ozawa. He was wonderful because he also had that idea. He said, yeah, you can't master anything. He would do master classes at Tanglewood, and he said, though, but it's just like a chef. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the word for chef in French is chef, and the word for conductor in French is also chef. So chef is chef. And so the idea of creating flavors, he said, you have to have the taste, and then you know how to try to find them. But he talked very much about living between the beats. And of course, he's famous for having perhaps the clearest technique ever. I mean, he's
but also very fluid.
But there's a kind of way his hands moved between the beats. I mean, he had I think more than anybody, he had the ability when he was conducting in one to show whether it was a one that was divided into two or three or four. I don't know how he did it, but it was like or he did, and he tried to describe it to us one time. And maybe this is an example of how conducting can't be taught. He said, well, it's a question of where the beat is slower and faster. And when he did it, it was like you could see 3 or 2 or 1. I mean, you could feel, it's like you had the impression that he could subdivide 1 into 17 equal parts and show it with his technique. But that was
Mr. Muti was saying it's in the wrist, the 3.
I mean, another brilliant technique and a wonderful conductor, but it's a very different kind of thing.
But it's interesting. I mean, and I'm fascinated with this, and I would love to hear your comment on it. It seems that we all end up talking about some central core thing, be it in piano playing or string playing or Tai Chi or Alexander technique or conducting this, and this flow and the non-interruptedness is something that I think we are preoccupied in all these so adjacent territories to music making. Seems
I think it is all about that. And once we I threw out this kind of slightly provocative and totally pretentious title for this talk. I started thinking about it since we discussed this a few days ago. And I guess my short answer would be yes, but the long answer is no. You can't really teach conducting. All you can do is teach music, and people have to figure out themselves how to incorporate that into conducting. Of course, that's a kind of a cop-out answer. But the point really is then teaching conducting is necessarily about creating the biggest musical imagination possible. It's very much like playing an instrument. I always think that the people who have truly the best techniques have the most musical imagination, because it's the musical imagination that creates the demand, the need for technique. And it's the same with conducting. If you know somehow what you want to express, and it's so vivid, then the hands take care of themselves. That having been said, there are still, of course, certain basic things that you have to learn.
Yeah, and of course, of themselves is somewhat idealized. I mean, in the ideal case, that the imaginations are so strong that the hand finds the motion, but there's a lot of work and stations on the way to that. No, right. At least in instrumental playing.
Yeah, but if you don't have the idea that sound can be kind of fleeting and weightless, if sound for you, if the area of sound is not developed to the point, this is one of those areas, if you're not thinking that sound can either be heavy and hard to move or light and easy to move, you're never going to try to create a gesture that's like fleeting and doesn't fix itself anywhere, and then a sound that that has friction as it goes through time. So that kind of musical imagination has to precede the idea that there are different kinds of beats, and the body itself can take on different textures. And if you're feeling that something, and that's really how you feel about the music, there's literally no way that you're going to conduct it like this. It just can't happen.
Yeah, you might like this. Mr. Radosh once said to me, just to paraphrase, but more or less the idea was that in some way so-called great or virtuosic technique is when the musical gesture and the physical gesture that is done to produce it is in closest alignment. This is actually great technique. Be it on the piano, violin, or I guess in conducting. There are questions, which is wonderful, and in no particular order, I will integrate them into our conversation. One just came from Menachem Zur, who says, well, what about the analysis of the score in terms of harmony and voice leading? But I think generally, so we've talked a little bit about gesture and the physicality, which I'd like to come back to, but you also spoke about, well, you have to have the ideas, the understanding of music. So how is that to be gained for conducting students?
Completely important and fair question, because I haven't so far said anything about it, but it's not that I don't think about it.
Oh, I know, and I'm sure.
No, I have to defend myself. It's like I sometimes study my scores, but it's actually I think harmony, obviously voice leading. I mean the way notes line up vertically and horizontally. I would call the harmony is more vertically and the voice leading is more horizontally, is something you have to really understand at obviously the deepest level possible. And the more I study, the more I'm interested. I mean, specifically interested in harmony. We were told when we were starting out, you have to do a harmonic analysis, and you put Roman numerals, and this is a 5 chord, and this is a 3 of 6 chord, and you see these classes where actually what the teacher seems to be looking for is a kind of number that goes with every chord that occurs, sequentially, and I don't mean harmonically sequential. I mean just in order, and that's not really enough. You have to know. I mean, you improvise. You know how harmonies work. You have to kind of sense where the center of gravity is in the harmony as the piece goes along. And sometimes it lives for a while in this area, and sometimes it lives for a while in this area.
Absolutely, and this is there is an issue that so often, let's say, so-called theoretical disciplines are not taught, I find, in a way that bridges and connects to the practical implications of. So what does it mean, all these numerous? But so when you speak about the gravity in harmony, or where does the metric or harmonic stress come? This is often somehow not discussed.
It's not discussed, and also
theory
and just putting a number on a chord doesn't mean you understand what it actually is doing. And 3 of 6 of 2. It's like, what is that doesn't mean anything. You have to kind of know enough music to know how harmony, kind of call it normal. This is a gross oversimplification, but how it normally goes, and how the composer creates surprise and unexpected, and turns it into a different area. And the key notes that need to be understood for their function in shaping that flow of center of gravities. And the more I study, the more I'm interested in finding those, call it pivot points, where the harmony does this or that. And the harmony can very often feed you the texture of the sound, the quality of sound that you want. There's something, the harmony and the quality of sound are really inextricably connected. And then, of course, the voice leading means you have to know what's there. Sometimes people ask me, you do scores, you conduct by heart. Do you really know every single note? I don't. Not every single note. Of course, that would be the ideal. In a perfect world, I guess I would try to study every score to that point. But you have to know the function of everybody that's playing. And so if there's a whole group in the orchestra that's creating a kind of shimmery texture, I actually don't think it's important to know every single little, note, although it wouldn't be bad. I'm not able to do it. I frankly think almost nobody's able to do. There's some people who can probably know every single note in the score, but you do have to know the function of every instrument that is playing. And sometimes the function is creating a background. Sometimes it's playing a line that actually has to intertwine with something else. And the other area that, or an other area that we haven't even talked about, is how to hear what is happening, how to have huge ears when you're conducting. And I make the point quite strong, but the ability to, one exercise that I ask my conducting students to do is to play Bach chorales in open score. 4 lines, 4 independent lines. Absolutely, each line has its own life, and that's sort of the pinnacle of counterpoint. That's what, I mean, there are pieces with more lines, but 4 lines is already a lot to deal with. And if you can hear not only the harmonies and the sounds and the tune, but how each line works with all the others, you're doing very well. I mean, to really hear, and not just hear, but experience both vertically and horizontally at the same time, that's a very high level of hearing. And so to be able to hear, I can't remember who said it, might have been Strauss, but there are rarely more than 4 really important things happening in an orchestra, even if there are 40 instruments playing at the same time. You have to hear as much as you can, but to hear 4 lines at once is really, really hard. 3 lines, also extremely hard. But I make the point, 2 lines is hard. A lot of people don't even hear 1 line at a time. And by hearing 1 line at a time, I mean really following the line and shaping it the way a great, great artist would shape a single line. And the ability to conduct in a way that makes it possible for one person to experience the ups and downs and curves and
tribulations,
and everything. That's a high level of contact with that musician. And when there's counterpoint happening, you have to not only identify with each line, but somehow conduct in a way that
integrates.
It's a matchmaker.
Yeah. And you said you have your students play. How important do you find it is for conducting students, for future conductors, to be instrumentalists, and to which level or extent to be practicing players, as I know you are on violin?
I think it's very important. I think on some level you have to have experienced what it means to actually touch an instrument and make a sound. You don't have to be a great instrumentalist to necessarily be a great conductor, I think.
And in fact, we know a lot of great instrumentalists that are not good conductors.
That's a kind of touchy subject, but that actually is something that kind of just being a great musician doesn't necessarily mean you can conduct. There are a lot of instrumentalists who are interested in conducting. It seems to be a thing.
Disease.
Well, I don't know if it's a disease. It's a thing.
Contagious.
Well, I don't know, but there are many, and some are terrific and some are not. And some you wish you could say, oh, well, actually there is such a thing as a conducting technique that could prove useful to you, but yeah, it does. We don't have to talk about names, but that also maybe answers the question in a different way, because there are certain things that you absolutely can learn, just like what a gesture does. And you see wonderful musicians who are conducting, and they say to the orchestra, please don't slow down, and the orchestra's like, please keep conducting in tempo. It's hard to actually know, if you haven't done it enough or in the right way, what effect your gesture is having, and that is actually something that could be learned. But it's hard with that kind of musician. Sometimes the top musicians, who's going to tell them? Who's going to start correcting them? Because they're legends already on their instrument.
It's important to have friends that are honest with you. And just as a side remark, and you might disagree with me, but I'm curious. I find that, so on one hand, people talk about pianists and the piano repertoire as the closer to the symphonic repertoire because of the multiple voices and the control of harmony and certain self-sufficiency in the piano repertoire. On the other hand, it's not necessarily that pianists have the best, let's say, rate of conversion success into conductors.
Don't you think most, if you wrote down the instruments that most conductors play, piano would definitely come out first, don't you think?
Don't know. I mean, I'm curious. Not sure, because then, at least from those that sort of had an instrumental career and then sort of picked up conducting, I see more. It's string players, it's wind players, it's percussion, and not necessarily. I'm not sure if there's something that it's like transcribing orchestral sounding piano pieces for orchestra, like Felix Weingarten transcribing the Hammerklavier Sonata, and it's a very orchestral piece on the piano. Sounds terrible in the orchestra. So
we're doing a piece this week, the Brahms-Schoenberg Piano Quartet.
Yeah,
that's a nice transcription.
Yeah, well, and Mr. Schoenberg was a talent at everything. No, but that's a side question. A few more questions from our participants. Donata Cabrera, who you probably know.
Hey Donato, how are you doing?
He asked several questions. One of them was, can Alan address the importance of knowing and being aware of the recorded history of conductors and the importance of attending rehearsals?
Yeah, one of the things that I did when I got to New York was I immediately reached out to all the. This is the second part of that question, or the second question. I told all the music schools that they had essentially not there were exceptions, but essentially a carte blanche invitation to attend rehearsals at the New York Philharmonic. Certainly the conductors, but not only. Anybody was welcome. I thought that was a resource that New York could offer to its music students, and there are thousands, of course, that was useful. The conducting students almost never showed up at rehearsals, which I guess they're busy, they have classes and things, but that always just boggled my mind, when there's such an experience that is literally at your fingertips right there, not to take advantage of it. But of course then, like, a superstar conductor would show up and there would be 25 conductors sitting there, and it's fascinating. When Riccardo Muti would come and you watch him rehearse, it's astonishing. I mean, he's so brilliant, and the orchestra plays incredibly well, and Colin Davis, when he was around, the people would show up. Understandable, you want to be around the legends and the people who have had towering successes in the field, but actually that's not the best example of a rehearsal that you can watch. You need to watch the people who are struggling with the orchestra. You need to watch the people who are starting out and not convincing the orchestra, and that happens not often. The Philharmonic tends to get really good conductors, but you want to watch the people who are working hard to convince the orchestra to go with their vision, because that's more true to where they are as students. You have to see what works and also what doesn't work. If someone, I take Muti as an example because he's a great hero of mine and a wonderful conductor, of course. When he shows up, the orchestra's already sitting on the edge of their seats and just ready to go, and there's the expectation that it's going to be on the edge and thrilling and exciting. And so he almost doesn't have to, I'm not saying he's not brilliant at what he does, but just being there, just the fact that he's Riccardo Muti, then the orchestra is on its A game. That's not something that a young conductor can actually use in their approach, or when they themselves are standing in front of the orchestra. Recordings. Interesting subject. I don't like to learn pieces from recordings myself, but I like very much to listen to recordings. I think it's.
But once you've learned a piece, do you listen to a lot of versions too?
Well, I don't spend a lot of time listening to music, but of course I do, and love listening to recordings, especially the great old recordings where you can learn something, and there are moments of insight, because I think these things do come across, even in just audio recordings. You can hear the kind of insight, the level of insight, but also specific ideas do come across. And Carlos Kleiber famously listened to many recordings and just many recordings. And I guess he, was a genius. So he also listened to enough recordings that I guess they all kind of melded into something that became truly his, because it's absolutely personal what he did. And, he was blessed by being perhaps the most gifted conductor ever. But interestingly, he's one who famously listened to recordings.
Yeah.
But I think it's a little bit too easy these days to watch YouTube videos and imitate conductors. And if you stand in front of a good orchestra, like you said, you can make gestures that more or less fit in with what a conductor would do, and it can sound good, but you're not necessarily actually creating this one-to-one connection between your gesture and the sound. And I wouldn't actually call that conducting.
About Carlos Kleiber, there's an earlier question from Peter Rajsingh, who actually, in fact, had two questions. One was, what do you think of the Carlos Kleiber approach of focusing on a few works and really decorticating them? And second question was, do you have a view on Ben Zender's notion of tempi? For example, the opening bars of Beethoven Fifth are played wrong, etc. But maybe for a second, concentrating still more on Carlos Kleiber and broadening this question, what do you think? And I think you're in the other camp of somebody that has a huge repertoire, and this feeds sort of your general outlook and culture of music making. And then, of course, we have examples, somebody like Carlos Kleiber, or let's say Horowitz, who in piano, who had a rather concentrated repertoire, let's say, and played relatively few works in public. Horowitz more, Kleiber famously even less.
Yeah, my guess is that, well, I actually know that Horowitz knew many more pieces than he performed. And Kleiber, when he was younger, did a lot of contemporary music. He did many more pieces than he ended up being, super famous for later in his career. I think almost by definition, really fine musicians are familiar with the repertoire. And music is a wonderful field. There's no way to know everything. There's no way to know all the pieces, but a familiarity with the string quartet repertoire and the piano literature and lieder and opera. I think it's not an accident that many of the really fine musicians, when you speak to them, they are familiar with a lot of different pieces. The choice to focus on a small number of pieces is a luxury, and it could be nice. That's not how I like to live. I mean, I try not to be. Early in my career, I made a point to do as many different pieces as possible, and I tried not to repeat any pieces in the season because I was just trying to learn the repertoire. I don't really approach it quite that way anymore, but I admire people who know the literature, and I think it helps to have experienced a lot of music. There's a nice story about Horowitz that Gary Grafman told, that he never played Gaspard de la Nuit in public, but Gary said that he went to his apartment one time in New York, and Horowitz gave a private performance of that he says was maybe the best Gaspard that he ever heard.
Yes, and
so not only did he know it, he knew it to the level of performance.
And there's a similar recollection about Horowitz with Rudolf Serkin saying that the best Hammerklavier sonata that he heard was in Horowitz's house, Horowitz playing it privately for him. Yeah. And that's even not necessarily sort of the core repertoire that people associated with Horowitz on the concert stage. So that is indeed quite amazing. I think I'll be amiss if I don't pass on the question from Wayne Toes, who has asked twice already, have Hideo Saito's ideas influenced your conducting and teaching of conducting?
Well, first of all, hi Wayne, nice to hear from you. The Saito conducting book is a book that I make all my students read, and it's really hard to find copies of it. So that is something we need to talk about, because I think it's a masterpiece, and his conducting method. It's a strange book, actually, because it's possible to look at it and think that it's just unbelievably sort of desiccated technical kind of discussion without real sort of emotional content. At the end of the book, there's a chapter that says, oh, by the way, don't forget that all of this is in the service of the music. But it's extremely clinical and brilliant. I mean, it's the most unbelievable analysis of conducting technique that I think exists. And it's something that I grew up with. I mean, my father actually worked with Saito. My mom studied with Saito at Toho in Japan. And if you think about his success as a teacher, one of his first students ever was Seiji Ozawa. To start out teaching conducting and to create a Seiji Ozawa, I mean, how miraculous is that? Saito, he was a cellist himself, and Hideo Saito, and a great pedagogue, and he was largely responsible for the huge explosion of interest and proficiency in Western classical music in Japan. And he learned to conduct and conducted the Toho orchestra himself, and he analyzed conducting, and he worked with Shuntatsu Kono, who was another teacher there, to work on distilling conducting into its elements. And a lot of Seiji's brilliance came from that. And the book is very, very clear about the different kinds of beats, tataki, and the different, not the time to go into it, but it's fascinating. And there's certain techniques that Saito talks about that I've never seen anybody else use, like senyu, which is like subdividing to actually stop on the and of a beat. Nobody does that, and it's just so useful. One of the principles is actually, it's the exception of giving beats that have only points, nothing in between, just duck, 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 duck. You don't use it that often, but if you need to control a tempo, it's a very effective way. So there are actual technical tools that Saito presents that are, first of all, correct and useful. They work, and that are presented in a way that is more sort of pure and distilled to their essence than any other system I know. So I grew up with the answer is yes. Saito has very much influenced me, and I think it's something that everybody would do well to familiarize themselves with, and then take it as a starting point, because it's not the last word in sort of applying it to imagination of sound and the bending of time between the beats, and this kind of I call it the S curve of how timing exists through measures of music that are not pin downable, as we were talking about earlier today in our lovely rehearsal.
Yes, local turbulences versus general disturbances. And actually, speaking about, so I thought of now when you talked about older conductors and some insights that we gain. I would imagine that you've listened with great attention to some Furtwängler's recordings, and what I find, what fascinates me, are these sort of long-term contractions and expansions of time that he does over very long stretches, over basically like half of an exposition of Brahms' Second Piano Concerto or something like this. What do you and I don't find that so many people emulate that.
Well, who can? I mean, he was so unique. The thing that I would love to mention about Furtwängler that I find so fascinating, there's a clip of him rehearsing the Schubert B minor unfinished symphony, and he reacts to discrepancies in the musical vision, that is to say, musical choices that the orchestra makes that don't fit in with his interpretation, for want of a better word, as viscerally as if they played a wrong note. His concept of how the piece goes was so developed and so strong that it couldn't go any other way. And it wasn't that you could do it this way or that way. He had this unbelievably powerful vision that created a flow that it was as if the interpretation was in the text, if you see what I mean. And so doing it differently was just as bad as, playing a B flat and a B minor chord. It was that I found so impressive. And and his ability to manage spans of time, as you say, was just unique and I think unemulatable, actually. You can aspire to it, though.
Yeah, one can aspire. Well, I remember Radu Lupu told me, he said that I learned from Furtwängler's recordings. Sure. And I think you could sense that with Radu in a different way. Absolutely. Or translated way, this flow in time.
I only worked with Radu one time, and that was one of the most unforgettable experiences. It was Beethoven Fourth Piano Concerto, and what I remember is that it didn't feel like time flowed in the usual way. Obviously it's a rhythmic piece. Beethoven has his inner engine of rhythm, but something Radu did created a different way that time functioned. I don't know if you know what I'm talking. I guess you know what I'm talking about. But it's not that it wasn't rhythmic. It was just meta rhythm or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was magical because it didn't seem so subject to analysis of he waited here longer or there quicker. It was its own very organic thing. You've said a number of things about.
I'm speaking all over the map. I apologize.
I think this is the point. We are to be eclectic here, and we'll integrate more questions coming up, of course. But you've spoken about a conductor having this great outlook, having great knowledge, the necessary authority to bring to the orchestra. On the other hand, I see in interviews with some of your very young colleagues, young conductors, who oftentimes conduct some very big and important ensembles where sort of the prevailing polite leitmotif is, well, I learned so much from the orchestra, I learned so much from the musicians, which is all wonderful, and and as teachers we learn from students. But on the other hand, isn't it critical that a conductor, when, for example, they get a music director post, that they are in fact in some way a teacher to the orchestra and bring a certain accumulated knowledge that's overwhelming? Or do you think this is an unfair?
No, I mean it would be nice to have that kind of obvious hierarchy, if you will. I think there's a breakdown in the system if the conductor is merely deferential, but a healthy respect for the actual quality and experience and know-how that an orchestra brings is, it's ridiculous if you think that they only have something to learn. It's absolutely a two-way
No,
street.
of course, I don't mean, but you know what I mean also when...
Yeah, it's a tricky question because, happily, I would say, the days of the autocratic, terrifying maestro are gone, long gone. And I think it's it was high time when that happened. It's possible to be collegial, but of course you have to put your foot down, and there has to be an authority, and that's what orchestras actually need, I would say, and on some level even expect. One of the things that orchestras do is they talk about conductors and often talk not nicely about conductors. That's it's very it's well known and often deserved, and that's just what happens. But in the moment that you're working, they want a kind of structure in which to work. It's not fun, actually, even if it can be fun to give someone a hard time if they're making your life difficult. It's not fun to be in a situation in which you're not able to actually try your best, and that's really what musicians want to do. And they want to be created. They want a framework to be created in which it's possible, really, for them to use their abilities and their enthusiasm. And I think there's actually such a thing as natural authority, and not kind of willful, bossy authority that tends to work. I mean, the good orchestras, interestingly, the better the orchestra, the better the discipline. That's almost invariably the case. The better orchestras are ready to be worked with and want to be told things. And it's a myth that the better the orchestra is, that the more difficult they are. I mean, I guess if it's not working well, if the conductor is not adequate or not deserving of being there, then it can really break down. And that I've seen happen with conductors, unfortunate conductors, and that's really a sad thing to see. But generally speaking, the best orchestras are the most prepared when they show up at the rehearsals, and are the most serious about rehearsing, and are the most ready to work with the instruction that they're being given. And I find that interesting, and also, frankly, inspiring.
Absolutely. One of the members of the Berlin Philharmonic told me some time ago, said, "Oh, how was such and such week?" And I said, "Well, it was good, but the conductor kept telling us, how well we play. He said, we already know that we play well, but now tell us something, what we should do, and
yeah, I mean,
how we should
this
do
again,
the piece better."
Yeah, I'm not even going to mention the name of the orchestra, but I saw a very, very fine orchestra do a read through of a piece with quite a good conductor, and at the end of the read through in the rehearsal, the conductor said, "Wow, that's the best I ever heard that piece played." And it was a compliment to the orchestra, so there's often a kind of sympathetic applause that follows such a compliment. But it was also half-hearted, because that orchestra, and I had heard it not even 4 months ago, had played a much finer rendition of that piece with a different conductor, so they knew that it wasn't the best that they could do. And actually, that was the end. Then that was it. Then once the conductor, basically, you could see, like, okay, what do I say now? He didn't know what to say in the rehearsal, and he said a nice thing, and it did sound good. It was adequate. It would have been a nice concert. But once he sort of established that was his level, the orchestra said, "Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
It's not good. It's not. If it doesn't get better than that, then you're not good enough."
A particular question from Marc-Antoine Hamé. What is your view on conducting with eyes closed in the concert? I mean, we know some conductors.
Karajan famously conducted much of the time with his eyes closed. Everyone has to close their eyes from time to time to blink and things. I think it's nice to make eye contact with the musicians. I think that's one of the ways that human contact is the most powerful, and when you really make meaningful eye contact with someone, whether it's on a stage in an orchestral context or over a glass of wine, that's actually where you can have a meeting of souls in a I think quite powerful and important way musically. If you make real eye contact with someone, you actually not only are able to share how you feel about something, but you can also read how they feel about it. And it's something that I ask for, certainly in the orchestras that I'm music director of. I want a constant kind of eye contact from the musicians. And often, early on in the relationship, if I start talking about it, it feels, I think some musicians read it as kind of demanding from my side, because I really expect, when I look around, I expect immediate eye contact from the musicians. But I tell them, and it usually, I hope I say it myself, but I hope it actually gets to the point where they understand that I really mean it when I say it's not just about my imposing my will on you, but it's about making it possible for me to share in your musical impulses, and we can do something together then. And when musicians say, like, they oh, I can see you, and it's out of their peripheral vision, but they're not actually looking, I don't think that there's the same kind of synergy. So I guess the bottom line is I don't encourage conducting with eyes closed. I guess it can work, but there has to be a kind of meaningful contact. These days, it's pretty uncommon to conduct that way. And I would guess that if you're not careful and if it's not in the right context, or if you don't already have a good relationship with the orchestra, it could be read as a kind of pretension. I don't know. I don't know the particular, I don't know this person. I don't know. It's an interesting question, though, because there is a kind of, if you can create a kind of spiritual space inside yourself by closing your eyes that is compelling and readable to the orchestra, I guess it could be a very powerful thing. But as a basic sort of posture, my initial reaction is that maybe it's not the ideal way to plan to conduct.
Yeah. By the way, thank you, Wayne, for posting. Wayne posted the link to the Saito conducting method, because there were a lot of people in the chat that that asked for it. And
totally worth really delving into, reading carefully. You know, there's also a book of exercises, little musical examples that goes along with it, and there are even videos that Kazuyoshi Akiyama, another of Saito's early conducting students, posted that demonstrate the gestures. These are all very interesting to see.
Also, Rene Gulkers posted some links to conducting technique lessons, and that's all in the chat. Another question, it's a multi-layered question from David Smith, but to concentrate on part of it, and I'm very curious what you'll say. He says, I think many young conductors overconduct and lacking the confidence to know when to make themselves indispensable. About this overconducting and getting smaller or making smaller gestures. Just last week, Hannu Lintu and I had a conversation about this, and he said that he rather encourages his students to be exuberant at the beginning, because he said that this kind of conducting smaller is something that you need to come to organically rather than artificially.
I totally agree. One of the first things that that was told to me is when I was conducting is the beat is small. Someone said, "Oh, we can't really see what you're doing," and I guess I was, and I immediately, that was really one of the first times I ever conducted an orchestra. So that comment, since it came to me, carried a huge amount of weight, and so I made a point then to start beating with more amplitude in the gesture. And I don't think that was necessarily the best way to start for me. I think we have to define what over-conducting means. Over-conducting, does that mean just making big gestures? Because big gestures can be wonderful if it's appropriate. And the question is then, what does it mean to be appropriate? I think overconducting, what it actually means or what it should mean is making gestures that are not meaningful to the orchestra, that are not helpful. And that's not overconducting exactly. That's just bad conducting.
Misconducting, misdirecting.
That's a different thing. But yeah, it's true that sometimes I think with less experienced conductors, when something feels shaky, the instinct is then to start gesticulating a bit more wildly, and that's sometimes exactly the wrong thing to do. Also because, there is a technique, I would say, that that if something needs to be fixed, actually, if you stop entirely giving information, you force the orchestra to actually start listening and solving the problem themselves. So the opposite of doing kind of flailing, meaningless, wild gestures is actually creating a sense that, oh, you guys need to do something by not moving at all. It is a very difficult, it's a large subject that this David brings up because it also depends how the orchestra is playing. With greater orchestras, very often less is more. It's possible with very, very minimum gestures because, again, as I said, greater orchestras tend to have better discipline, tend to prepare more, also watch more. There's more reaction. The gestures give more meaning to the better the orchestra is, and sometimes the very slightest very focused, pointed gesture can have an enormous impact on an orchestra. With less good orchestras, with student orchestras, say, you have to actually, not only are you showing tempo, but you're trying to generate energy, and you don't need to do that as much with the big orchestras because there's a kind of energy that's an inherent energy, and you can get a lot more result with less gestures. So overconducting, I guess, if we're talking about large gestures, sometimes it's good to create a sense that the musicians should use large gestures themselves. But if they're not meaningful, focused gestures, then it can often cause more confusion than.
You remind me of two stories from your colleagues. Louis Langret once quoted to me that Semyon Bychkov, early on for Louis in his conducting career, gave him an advice. He said, when things are going wrong, conduct smaller. And he followed up saying, when it's going fine, they're not really looking at you too much anyway. And then when it's going wrong, they'll look up and there you stand like a windmill. So go smaller. And I asked our friend Daniel Harding about whether there are any parallels between piloting airplanes and conducting that he's found through his experience in flight training. And he said that one of the things apparently they teach pilots, that when something goes wrong, first thing you do is sit on your hands, meaning don't jump in, start fixing the thing. Right. And that a lot of the problems are actually caused by secondary panic of starting to fix it, which I found both fascinating also, for my own.
So when you start messing up a passage, sit on your hands, see how that works for you.
But in some way,
I understand. No, I'm just
the couple microns of time really do save that. We have more excellent questions. And by the way, David Smith sort of follows up by saying, by overconducting, I did not mean appropriately large gestures, but rather conducting details which need to be conducted, trying to be indispensable when really the goal should be to be dispensable. But I think it's partially my fault. But there's two ways to sort
by overconducting. I guess he means more micromanaging. In a way. I mean, what often, if you miss the forest for the trees and deal with too many details, often sometimes you end up interrupting the flow. And if you have enough technique to deal with a lot of things and keep the time going or the music going, actually there are no details that are not worth dealing with as long as they are dealt with in a way that doesn't blow them out of proportion or interrupt the general feeling of the music. So I think that's also dependent on sort of technical capacity, the ability to show things sort of along the way, like Seiji is able to do, with he can show lots of things that are happening along the way and little textural things and side gestures and commentary and from a secondary or tertiary voice. So in a way, it's only overconducting or micromanaging if you're not able to manage.
A related question to this, and with young conductors especially, but would you say that there is an emphasis, and I think it's a lot in discussion, so this, the conducting, so being clear and clarity, and do you think that leads to a certain standardization of motions that are both expected or that young conductors think they need to be producing, versus a more sort of fantasievoll, three-dimensional space and representation of musical gesture?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question entirely, but the fact is that everybody has a different body language and has a different way of using their hands and bodies, and if somebody looks very much like somebody else because they imitate them, then by definition there's a kind of lower grade quality to that conducting. I think people should not imitate and shouldn't try to look like other people, but you can also learn something about the gesture. But if it's not integrated in your conducting technique to the point that it looks personal, then you haven't quite achieved the necessary level. I don't think about it. People look so different.
So there is no, for in your mind, if you take, I mean, obviously everybody looks different, but if you take sort of the hands, you don't think there is a more a tendency towards more homogeneity and sort of standardization of the international conducting language?
I think there may be a tendency towards the homogeneity of the international music language, but that's it's related. But I think that the hand gestures might be collateral damage to that more important phenomenon.
Because I would say, I think, and this could provoke a lot of disagreement with my piano colleagues, but I think there is a certain maybe consolidation of sort of what does the pianistic language of today look like. I mean, of course, everybody plays differently, but I think with the sort of everybody watching everybody on YouTube and the so-called earlier national schools being more and more sort of homogenized, I think there's a sort of an international way of how do you play the piano well.
I think that's true. But it's also it's a necessary consequence of globalization and technological development and interconnectivity and the internet itself, and it's not exactly the same, but it does recall a very interesting lecture that I heard when I was at Harvard, given by Stephen Jay Gould, and he talked about, it was a funny subject because it was basically about geology and history of the earth, but one of his lectures was about, and this may or may not be meaningful to the people listening. You have to know baseball to know what I'm talking about. But why there are no longer any 400 hitters. A 400 hitter is someone who hits, who gets a hit 4 out of 10 times over a season. 400 means 40% in baseball. And there used to be 400 hitters, not anymore. Aaron Judge hit 312 or something this year, which was one of the best averages in baseball. And he said that that's a necessary, basically the edges of the bell curve of skill are being narrowed just as a natural progression of how things go. So there are not as many outliers either at the whole level is tending to get better because there are not as many people who are unskilled or untrained. And they're also not the sort of like outliers who just become kind of like unicorns by just virtue of talent, and someone who comes from a village that has no contact and learns to play the piano by themselves by some personal method. So there's a tendency towards homogenization just generally. That's kind of a natural progression. It was fascinating.
Which is triggered by globalization or by the fact that so many people are practicing the same thing,
and that there's more contact, so that the general level is higher. There are not as many, like the whole bell curve, the edges and the bottoms are cut off, And it's a little bit that way in music. I mean, you don't get people who like have an unusual technique because it's more like, say, people who learn to hold the bow like this. I mean, because everyone learns to hold the bow.
Or
More
Harpo
or less
Marx
the
learning harp his way.
yeah, right. And so that there is so much access to standard practices that I think it's true. But that having been said, I still think there's as much variety in approaches to music and gesture as there are people, and that hasn't changed.
Yeah, luckily. I must say, I find it's a similar thing with modern piano making, whereas, even some 20, 30 years ago, and certainly earlier, you'd go and you'd find a piano or two that were outstanding, and then you'd find 7 that were unacceptable, and now you go and they're all good, but the unicorns are hard to find. But the overall level, there are fewer ones with mistakes in built in. But if we're on the subject of globalization, cannot resist asking you about its effects on orchestras and on orchestral sound, and that's something that I guess changed very much, where that was so geographically distinct. Or do you still find that it's quite distinct in your experience?
I think it's still quite distinct. It may not be as obviously distinct as it once was, where an orchestra that played in Czechoslovakia or someone would have a sound that was so wildly different from the London Symphony or something like that. But it's maybe similar to the fact that organs were tuned at different pitches in different towns in Germany, and then people would learn music in a different way because that's all they would ever hear. But I think actually, I'm happy to say that I think orchestras are very distinct. Orchestras are able to do more of the same things now. It's like you get orchestras like here in Germany or in South America or in Japan or whatever, and they'll all play really good West Side Story symphonic dances. They can do that. They can play a nice Bruckner symphony. So there is a kind of coming together of stylistic approach, but it's incredible how different orchestras feel. It's the way people are different, and you can buy clothes from Uniqlo everywhere, but still doesn't mean that everyone dresses the same.
And when you listen to recordings, are you good at a guessing game of which
I shouldn't say this, but I think I'm pretty good at it. But sometimes it's very hard. It is very hard because orchestras are... I think one of the qualities that is now celebrated in orchestras is the ability to change the style according to the music that is being played. I think people try to be correct in the way, like if you play French music, there's a kind of French sound, or if you play Germanic music, there's a kind of Germanic sound, or if there's, if you play Stravinsky, it should have a certain kind of sound, or Copland or whatever. I think orchestras everywhere try to be true to the sound. In Baroque music, very often people play less vibrato or something. That's there are modes of stylistic approach that are pretty generally accepted, which means that if you hear French music played in France, it might be a little different from the way they play it across the border in Germany, but there's a kind of similarity of intention that probably wasn't quite as strong. I think it didn't matter so much, say 50, 60, 70 years ago, to try to get the style just so, to fit the way the music should be played. And that's why you get a Brandenburg Concerto played with, 20 first violins and 10 basses, and it would be laughed at today. No orchestra would do that. So there is a kind of sense that, there is a way that music should sound. And maybe that's a relatively new phenomenon.
Interesting. Here's a question that's dear to my heart, again from David Smith, because I'm left-handed. And not that I'm threatening to start conducting, but he asks, should naturally left dominant individuals be right dominant when conducting?
No.
So you,
No.
whatever hand feels.
Yeah.
And the second question from him is, baton or batonless? Is the answer purely an individual matter or perhaps repertoire determined?
Yes.
Good. Well, we'll move. we'll move on from that. There's a question from Takao Kanayama. Alan,
Hey,
I came
Takao.
in
How are you?
late, so I just wanted to know: have you mentioned about what you learned from OWM, which I presume is
Otto-Werner Mueller. No, I haven't, but he was a huge influence on me, and he was the teacher at both Curtis and Juilliard, and I studied with him at both places. An amazing intellect, amazing musical mind. I think it's fair to say quite rigid in the way he taught conducting. He was one who actually wanted his students to codify their technique in his way. After his approach, and he even had exercises where you literally had to choreograph the gestures to a piece the way he taught you, and it became a kind of thing that you would get like a whole line of Mueller students doing exactly the same kind of highly choreographed, quite stylized gesture. But his point was that you actually had to learn that to be able to coordinate and do exactly what you wanted your hands to do. So it was a kind of means to an end, but it did often mean that a lot of his students did end up looking kind of similar. The thing about Mueller that I think was hugely admirable is he had such a respect for the score, and it was so dedicated to serving the music as honestly as possible. And it meant that he was the most exhaustive studier of scores, and the most took the analysis and study of scores to the farthest level of anyone I ever saw in terms of his knowledge of the score. He really did know all the notes, and he had his system of color coding scores and marking things and cross-referencing, and lessons with him were both fascinating and could be incredibly infuriating, because he would just sit and talk for 2 hours, just like, and here's this happens and this. He would point out all the things that he had noticed in the score, and it was incredible because it set the standard for doing preparation for score, doing score preparation, unbelievably high. And he would also mark every single orchestral part that the musicians had in front of them on the stage, extremely carefully to, if there was a figure that, say you had a string of eighth notes, if it was written like 4 and 4 and 4, he would always rebar them so that the 4 notes that worked together were under one bar, and then he would split them. So he would make it musically as clear as possible with the notation, and he would spend countless hours doing preparation like that. And the thing that I think more than anything I took away from my study with him is how much it's possible to study a score. I never I think managed to actually achieve that level of study with any one piece that I do, but there are other ways of studying a score also that he didn't discourage, but he didn't specifically encourage people to go into that kind of more personal sense of what a score means to you. It's not that he didn't do that, and he was a very profound musician himself, but that's not what his teaching was about. He really had his system of teaching conducting codified, and if you didn't transcend it, it was possible to be kind of stuck in that world. But many of his students did take that as a launching pad. But the system was so rigid and so sort of determined that you had to consciously be aware that there was more to do. And if you didn't follow his way of teaching he would really crush you. So it was extremely difficult to have your own kind of system. I mean, the first couple of years I studied with him, it was a fight because I resisted. I felt it was too too I don't know.
Restrictive,
I felt restrictive, and he felt that he didn't like resistance, and so he pushed back, and it was I suffered. I wanted to quit conducting, and then I thought, you know what, I'm going to study with him. I'm not going to drop out. I'll just, in a sense, get rid of my sense that I needed to prove myself or show him that my way was valid, and I'll just go along with this system.
Do you think that was his goal all along?
Yeah,
or
yeah. He wants to break you down, and maybe this is a too strong way to put it, but that's actually his approach. He would try to like strip away any preconceptions that you had, and then build you up. And the successful students that he had were able to be built back up, and some people it didn't work for, and that they would just be left with that kind of stripped away shell. But I consciously made a decision in the middle of my second year studying with him. It's like, okay, I'm going to go with the program. It's okay. I can suffer. If I need to, I can try to bring it back later. And it was a palpable change instantly. And he started to really enjoy working with me, and we didn't resist, and he started giving me more opportunities. And that was the right approach with him, is just to give in, just to succumb in a way. And I have to say, there's not one day that goes by now, literally not one day, in which I don't think about something that he talked about. I mean, he always wanted the phrase to go to the end. It was always about carrying the phrase through and uncoiling at the end of the phrase, the end in time of the phrase, which is very powerful because you want to make sure that you don't lose the line and that it doesn't collapse in the middle, and that you're able to sustain the length of the phrase. The problem with that is that some phrases don't do that. Some phrases go the other way. But if you were conducting along and if you let the phrase collapse in the middle and didn't consummate the journey to the end of the phrase by unfolding and uncoiling at the end, he would stop you instantly. We would do lab sessions conducting the orchestra in which we would get through not even a full exposition of a Haydn symphony, because he would stop you right away. It was hard.
And this, of course, this is anyway interesting about teaching anything and our modern societal discourse of how much in teaching and education should be encouragement and sort of commiseration with all the difficulties that the students have, and what now is often described as the older approach of, well, it's tough, but then you have somebody like yourself who says that this had such a lasting and ultimately positive impact. And of course, I guess as teachers, try to find a good way to combine this, but it seems that sometimes the pendulum swings the other way, and it's so much about encouragement that no criticism is practically expected in an educational setting.
People get slammed for being too tough as teachers these days.
Well, there was that New York Times article recently about the organic chemistry professor at NYU that got
fired
and being an.
I mean, I don't know enough about it, but on the face of it, that seemed odd to me. But no, I mean, Mueller, definitely a great pedagogue, no question. But I think it's fair to say that it worked better for some than for others.
As with all teaching, but I do find that I often think about it with students that, of course, as a teacher, one has to very much think about how to teach the student. But I find that as a student, and I remember doing it or still doing it now, as a student, one has to also very much think about how to study and how to study with that particular person. Absolutely. Not just, well, this doesn't work for me. Or maybe why not to find a way for making it work and learning some vital things from a person, if you think they have something to give, of course.
Yeah, I think, it's not so much something I've experienced, but I've seen this sense, I don't know if it's entitlement, but so many students think that the teacher needs to fit to their expectation of what the studying should be. And that's, something a lot of people in education are talking about these days. And it's like the empowerment of the students and how somehow they exercise undue control, at least according to some people, over how teaching can be done. And I guess the pendulum has swung to that point. I mean, it used to be that teachers could be abusive and get away with anything, and that's not desirable, obviously. The truth probably, as with all fascinating subjects, lies in that kind of mysterious middle ground.
And is contextual. Menachem Zur asked earlier, do you introduce your students to contemporary music, especially post-tonal? And of course, I know that you do, and I know that so-called modern music is very important to you, as it is naturally. Maybe you can talk a little bit about it vis-a-vis the students, but also later can we touch briefly upon your thoughts on the institution of the orchestra and our ever expanding library of repertoire, which now, we're having the discourse from essentially from Renaissance music to today, which is a much broader swath, and it's seemingly orchestra is now expected to play competent Bach cantata and a good classical symphony and a romantic symphony and so on. And is that possible, and what are your views on this? Ivan Fischer spoke earlier in this forum with very strong views about this, but I would love to hear your thoughts on sort of what is possible for the modern orchestral body.
I think modern orchestras can and should be as versatile as a lot of orchestras are and are trying to be, and really try to cover this amazingly wide swath of repertoire. It's a tricky question, and I don't know exactly where the truth lands, because I read descriptions of me as a contemporary music specialist, which always surprised me, actually, because
something you always learn by reading about yourself.
Yeah, no, but it's I'm extremely dedicated to doing as much contemporary music as I can. I think it's important for music as an art form to be carried forward by people who are championing what's happening today. It's also with the encouragement of future composers in mind. I want composers to continue to feel that it is worthwhile but truly important to keep slogging away. Maybe it's not at the page now, it's on the computer screen, but however one puts notes to paper or electronic files, that it's something that bears fruit. It must be the hardest thing, I think, for any musician to compose, and it's a very vital time. It's tricky because there's so many different ways to compose now. There are no rules now. You don't even have to put notes on paper. What passes for music is extremely broad. And I think orchestras are magnificent in their capacity to do so many different things. I mean, you can do a piece by Gérard Griset, or you can do a Ligeti Requiem, or you can do a Monteverdi overture, or you can there are lots of things that orchestras can do, and they can play a Broadway show, and I think that's good. Orchestras are able to do that. I mentioned tricky. I think what's tricky is that the essence of what an orchestra is, I think, is still based in the what is called, this sometimes disparagingly, the standard repertoire. And at the end of the day, I think it still is harder to play a great Mozart symphony than almost anything else. And the need to really live in that world of Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert and Brahms and Schubert or George Chadwick or Florence Price or whomever, this kind of the music that gave rise to the modern symphony orchestra, I think is extremely important, and the skills that are called on to play a great Bruckner symphony actually serve the approach to other post-tonal, more modern music more than the other way around. So I still think there is something central about the what is called the core repertoire, and that's, you know, it's such a fraught time. You know, even calling it that is sometimes frowned on these days. But I hope my point is clear. It's without wanting to cancel or ignore other trends or other types of music. I think what orchestras do is best preserved by continuing to be able to play that so-called standard repertoire with real insight and sophistication and depth of understanding. There's only a certain amount of time, and you know, in a season you can't play more than the amount of pieces that fit on the programs that you present across the course of the season. I mean, that's a kind of a non-statement, but the idea that, you know, I see orchestras sometimes taken to task in the newspapers that serve their communities for not doing enough of this or not doing enough of that, sometimes justified, but sometimes I think, how do you expect actually an orchestra to cover all the bases? There have to be editorial decisions that are made. I think the spirit of inquiry and in curiosity about a wide range of music and a wide range of cultural backgrounds that led to music, I think, is essential. And that's something that I think is widely celebrated these days. But there's no way to deal with that, all the exigencies perfectly, because there's so many demands that go in different directions and sometimes in contrary motion.
I agree, and it's I think what you said, that a certain so-called standard repertoire, for lack of a different definition right now, is what gave rise to so many things that came later. So it seems to be also for instrumentalists, for pianists, you know, that the Viennese composers, the Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, this
play your Bach, play your Chopin, you know.
This like gave rise. I like Reinhard Goebel said that he prefers to come to something knowing what it comes from rather than looking back. So like when you play Brahms, that you understand that this came because of whatever happened before. So it's good to be connected to history versus being oblivious.
Yeah, and this idea that somehow history should be thrown out, which is maybe exaggerated, but you do, you know, hear about this kind of idea that it's, you know, don't celebrate these things because they you know, they don't apply to what, you know, what our world is today. I think that's misguided.
Absolutely. Question from Ronald Vermeulen. Hi, Alan. Greetings from Lyon. What advice would you give for a more mature person, an experienced orchestra musician who very much feels a calling to start conducting? It can be daunting determining how to begin.
You know, it's there's so many places that conductors can find expression, and the experience that someone who's been in the music world for a long time, either playing an instrument or as a listener. I mean, there are a lot of ways to get there. There's no one route, and there's no timetable that has to be followed. A lot of musicians in orchestras are conducting and doing things. I don't really know what the question is about advice. I mean, I would say the advice is do it. Absolutely. If there's an orchestra that you either create or work with or needs you or wants you, why not? It's not necessary to. We don't have to specialize. You know, I love to play chamber music. I like to play violin or viola. I love not conducting, and some people who play instruments most of the time in their careers, they like conducting too, and why not? And some are extremely good, and I think it can feed into the other things you do. Everything you do actually is connected to everything else you do. So I don't know what the question is exactly, but I would just say why not?
Yeah, just do it. Two questions we can group together. One from Joe Chadwick, whom we both know very well, and one from Sarah Zaslav, we also know. Sarah asked, how do you teach conducting for concertos specifically? Coordinating with a soloist seems like a whole special set of skills onto itself. And Joe asked something similar earlier. He said to each of you, what might be the particular challenges and joys for a conductor when working with a soloist and vice versa?
Well, first of all, hi to you both. Sarah, I've been reading some of your posts on Facebook, and it makes me really want to reconnect. It's been far too long, and it sounds like you're doing great things, and I hope we can have a conversation sometime soon. Thank you for the question. And Joe, hi. Get back to work. Just kidding. I love working with, let's just put it this way. I like working with soloists that I like working with. And it is a different skill because, philosophically, I actually am more than happy to give over the sort of the lead. Like if you're dancing with someone leads and I'm not a good dancer, but the image of having a couple of people dancing, one might lead and maybe you switch and the other leads. Anyway, it is a kind of dance with a soloist, but I'm happy to be led. And really try to go with the tempo and the character and the timing of the solos, especially. And I'm spoiled because I tend to work with, an extremely high level of soloists. And working with you is so easy because I think we have a lot of agreement and we come to music in a kind of similar way. But you have such a, fiercely developed point of view about how the music goes. It's easy to sort of piggyback on that and ride with it. The ability to follow that and transmit the signal to the orchestra that supports the timing and the character of the musician, of the soloist, is it's not self-evident. It's something that you do have to learn how to do because when the principle of conducting, of showing things before they happen, like preparing a gesture, has to start before the sound happens. And sometimes you have to start preparing a gesture before knowing exactly when that sound is going to come. And so it's a little bit of guessing, it's a little bit of reading the body language or the musical intention language of the soloist. It's a skill, it's an art, dare I say. It also depends on the repertoire very much. If you're conducting a Brahms piano concerto, there is a kind of symphonic element to the edifice that is the concerto, and that has to be also managed by the conductor. It's not something that you're passively accompanying when you're conducting a Brahms, or any piece really for that matter, but there are differing degrees of that. And the ability to read a soloist's intention and to create a gesture that lines up with the timing, given this need for gestures to be initiated before the event actually happens, is tricky. But it's fun to try to do it. I don't know if
I imagine you feel similarly, but I find that there's a lot of modeling that goes on now. You sort of I find that when I play with the conductor in orchestra or in chamber music or so-called accompanying, that you obviously, if you're just reactive, when you're just reactive, it's already too late. So you sort of create a model of what you think it's going to go like, and sometimes you're obviously surprised, especially if the person is inconsistent with what they're projecting as to where they're going. But I find that like one makes a certain model prediction of what it might be, and then you take a chance. No? Or is that how it works for you?
No,
we've never talked about it. But
there are a couple of moments where we weren't totally in sync today, and the fun thing with you, if I may say, is that, of course, we both notice it immediately, and then we decide, and then there's either a wordless communication, okay, we're going to solve it this way, or we actually just say, is it going to happen this way or that way? And it takes very little effort and very little time to sort of sort out what the plan for the next time we play that passage is. It's not always that way, as I'm sure.
No,
you
and
you
I
know.
think there must be a certain level of comfort in the sense that it's okay that it landed, in different spots, and then we see, because it's of course we could try to make it never happen, but that's not the point.
Well,
So
dare I say that when it doesn't land perfectly together with us, if I may say, it's not because it's I've made mistakes today, and it all happens, but it's actually sincere. The intention is maybe slightly different, which is natural because people feel things differently. But again, we're so close. Basically, there's no talking necessary. I always say with the soloist, if you have to really discuss and talk about things, then it's probably too late already.
Yeah, there's not enough time anyway, and probably won't help. And to answer Joe, since he said so, and and vis-a-vis, vice versa, with a soloist, I find that, just like you said, it's a sort of the mirror impression that as a soloist, yes, I know, and I think as a soloist in a concerto, one has to know what are the moments when you send a very clear signal, and it is on you to send the signal. But there are so many times when the signal is not to come from you, and this is a constant dance of following and leading, and that role is so ever shifting. And I find that's what's one of the fun things about.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's not interesting to either all the time dominate or all the time following. This is very monochromatic.
With the good soloists, there's always the request from time to time. Oh, could you please give this because I need to take it from you, and it's frustrating to deal with a soloist for whom that's never the case. It doesn't happen that often. But let me ask you a question. Are there ever times where the contact or the dialogue or the communication with the conductor is so bad that you feel you really can't do an adequate job?
Yes, I think that happens, and that happens also sometimes it's the piano, But so there is something that really prevents one from doing an adequate job. On the other hand, we are so-called professionals, though that sounds it's a very alarming word. So I'm sure we both have developed, and everybody has developed certain survival skills. So even if then you make it somehow happen. And I do know, and that is fun, in problematic situations with conductors, there are corners in concerti that, if the viola hears a certain note from the piano, either late or early, then then they'll respond to that auditory impulse, and if the conductor is doing something else, it sort of goes by them. So of course that's not what you need to do when somebody's actually driving the car, but when nobody's driving the car, that's those are helpful sort of buttons to know that can be activated, but that doesn't work for the entire piece and doesn't work for the repertoire. So, but there is sometimes a feeling that this is not it's not helping the process, and so it kind of creates it cancels out also the orchestral impulse. I find when the conductor is not helping the proceedings, and then half the orchestra wants to do something, the other half is paralyzed by it, and then it's a sort of unlucky situation. But that happens, hopefully. It does happen rarely. So
yeah, well, I know
mostly
you tend to, you can write your own ticket and work with the people you want. So I'm happy that you seem to enjoy working with me.
Well, no, I love working. This goes without. Well, it goes with saying and without saying. But listen, maybe one final question, and I've taken a liking to asking it from the guests that come, that are very passionate people, mostly in the arts. I mean, we had some people that from different fields, but mostly in the arts. There's so much discussion about the role of the arts in society, and on a closer to our corner, the discussion of the so-called classical music, for lack of better word. Orchestras are often the spotlight because this requires more financing. It requires concert halls that are purpose-built for the most part. And you're a very eloquent person. What are in your mind, some of the effective things to say as advocacy and sometimes as defense of, why do we need another concert hall? Why do we need to give so much money so this orchestra exists? So we play a piece by Beethoven, who's been dead for a very long time. And it seems that arts are so often, let's say, not attacked, but criticized and questioned.
Yeah, it's of course somehow what we do and the life choices we have made are implicit answers to your question, because we obviously believe in the primacy and importance and need for the arts and music. To put it into words in a way that is compelling and that actually has political consequences is not easy. And when we're in a crisis situation, such as the one that we're all living through now, I guess it's always been this way, but it somehow feels as if it's getting worse. The question of priorities becomes very stark. Actually, what do you actually need? What is necessary for life to continue? And sometimes, having classical music is not the first thing on the list.
No, if you're firemen, we're not brain surgeons.
If your city is being bombed, you're not really thinking about the concert that you're not going to that evening. It's a terrible time. But that having been said, the possibility of creating a space of shared humanity and cooperation and mutual respect and love and mutual understanding is very high when you're in a splendid concert. It's amazing what music can do. It's idealistic, maybe seems naive, but I've just recently been talking to a dear friend and great hero of mine, Jan Eliasson, who was the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations under Ban Ki-moon, and he was also formerly Foreign Minister of Sweden, and very storied and brilliant statesman and diplomat, and he loves music, and he particularly likes Bach, and he's also friends with Yo-Yo Ma, who just won the Birgit Nilsson Prize in Stockholm, and I did a concert with Yo-Yo just on Sunday, playing the Dvorak Concerto with the Royal Stockholm Philharmonic, my former orchestra, and Jan came to that concert, and we were talking afterwards, and he said, your idea of this Musicians for Unity, I hatched this idea in the last year that I was music director in New York of creating a network of musicians who band together to play concerts at specific geographic locations where this message of shared humanity and optimism and peace and cooperation could be useful. I think we need to talk about that again, because when you're in a space like that, no one was thinking about the war in Ukraine during that concert. Maybe people were, but there was this, one of those beautiful moments where you feel in the concert hall where everybody's on the same wavelength and nothing else matters. And Yo-Yo is such a charismatic, brilliant musician. Just, he emanates this warmth, and people get happy when he's in the room. And that's really the only thing you can think about. There are not that many situations in which that kind of powerful shared experience happen. And I think music is still, after all, one of the potential forces for good. And does in fact bring people together. And of course it's the old cliche, but couldn't be truer that music is the universal language, and it's possible to communicate and share with people even if you don't speak the same actual language, because music can speak even if people haven't heard Bach. If they hear Bach in a culture where Bach is not available, then still there's an immediate and visceral response to the music. And I would just like to do whatever I can to continue to make sure that music at the highest level is available, because I think it is something that the world needs and makes and does make life more beautiful. It's an elusive, kind of evanescent target that's hard to capture. But I couldn't feel it more strongly, and I think that the connection of music to nature. We have to work on nature in the world. Climate change is real, and somehow there is something resonant with nature that music achieves. I think even more than any other art forms. So it's not really an answer, but it's something that drives me, and it keeps me going. And despite the fact that I'm finding myself more cynical these days than I've ever felt, I used to always think of myself as optimistic, and sometimes I think, maybe it's just not going to go so well. But I don't want to succumb to that, and I hope we can continue to make music and use it for, I think, as the powerful force that it really is and deserves to be.
Well, I agree with, as beautifully said, I agree with you, especially in the sentiment of this, the communal aspect of making music and the communal aspect of listening to music. And that's, I think, something that also we palpably felt the situation took away from us during the pandemic, this inability to gather together and to pay such intense attention to something, in this case, something that we find very beautiful, namely the musical substance, and that seems to be a very human thing. This gathering communally. This would possibly provoke another 2-hour discussion, and we can't stay here for that long. The sentiment or the expression that music is a universal language for me is somewhat fraught, because also there's my own limitation, but I don't find the sound of Chinese opera or some Indian tunings speaking to me in a way that I would say this is a universal language. It seems to me, in fact, quite localized, but we could possibly agree that certain...
Well, let's have that discussion, because it doesn't mean that you have to understand the language just because it's universal. I think that okay, we're getting into philosophy.
Yeah, we're going to get into semantics, as if we don't understand the language, how universal is it?
Yeah, no, fair enough. But or you don't have to like it.
Well, that's something else. Well, I just wanted to throw it out there. Maybe it's a phrase that's thrown, in my opinion, and this is not a criticism, but in my opinion, it's thrown around so quite easily that it's a universal language, and so often it refers, I know not in your case, but so often it's referring to, our classical music, and that actually feels...
No, not necessarily. No, I just, quickly, we will have this other discussion, but the idea that you can actually sing a song for somebody or make sounds and have people react in a visceral way, even if they've never heard that piece or even that style of music, I think that is real. And there's certain aesthetic and cultural differences that make one type of music harder than another to immediately grasp. But I would maybe even argue that perhaps you understand those examples that you gave maybe more than you think or letting on.
Yeah, and of course, this is then a whole different philosophical discussion of whether one understands anything, or particularly music. But perhaps we could settle, I'm just thinking, we could settle on something rather indisputable, that music is universally present. It seems that anthropologists say that there is no human society that does not make music in one way or another. So
I will posit that with you right now. So I agree with that.
music is universally present. It's so wonderful to have your presence physically. It's so wonderful to have the presence of everyone online, and I appreciate this again, as I said, as a communal experience, and very thankful for all the questions and the comments. And I think we're very thankful to the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, who is hosting us this week musically and in this wonderful container where we brought a piece of Kronberg Academy with this online forum. So thank you very much, Alan.
Can I just quickly ask you a question? Did we answer the question?
Who knows? I think that's as you were talking about before in teaching. I think it's for the teacher to point out the areas of problems or what there is to think about.
Just areas.
Yeah, areas, and that I think you've done brilliantly. And the rest we ponder.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having me.
Alan.
This
Thanks,
has been
everyone.
really fun.
Thank you.